Hi, Richard here from animate.com, and in this video we are going to shade a huge landscape, a canyon landscape. So let's start. I already generated the landscape like in the previous videos, and you see there's a lot of rocks and canyons, walls, which are now going to be colored. But before we do that, I want to have a look at the 2D erosion function. It will generate a flow map based on the resolution we set here. So it will take a time. We're currently generating a 1 megapixel image. Once done, we can use this flow map in the shader editor, and for that it already generated a shader node group for us. So let's open the shader editor. I will open a new area down here and load the shader editor. Here we see that our landscape already has a material applied, and our flow map node group is generated and placed next to the principled BSDF shader. We have 3 different outputs and 2 inputs. One value is the strength, how much flow we want to show, and one is the width. So let's have a look at that right away. I'm going to render mode in cycles, and I will add a sky background. I go to the world settings, background, surface, and load the Nishita sky texture in here. It's much too bright now. I will lower the sun. I will raise the altitude to 1,500 meters, and I will add some dust and ozone. And we end up with our canyon being in a shady sunrise. If it's still too bright, I can lower the strength of the sky itself. And I will start to plug in the flow in the base color to see what that is about. Let's set the width to 0. So we see a very sharp flow of sediment flowing down. The stronger we make the flow, the more dirt and erosion we will see. And you see, if I increase the value, these trails get longer and longer. Have a look here between the peaks. There are rivers of dirt going down here as well. So the flow map will tell our textures in which direction to be distorted and flown down. There is another grayscale value which is called sediment, and if the flow is 0, we will see that the sediment is generally just a distribution of the height. But once the strength is changed, we will see that this grayscale gradient will start to move down according to the erosion flow, while the flow output will only give us the intensity of flow without respect of the height of the landscape. So if we have a strength of 0, the flow will return black. But if we increase the strength, we will see brighter and brighter pixels where the flow is strong, and they will remain black where there is no flow, as for the peaks, for example. So this is a very useful map, especially for animation, but also for quickly masking our landscape and adding some rivers of dirt and mud on the slopes. So now let's see how we can access the Vertex Colors. If I go to Input, since Blender 3.2, the Vertex Colors are called Color Attribute. And as mentioned in the previous video, this simple color attribute is very useful to quickly shade our landscape. But before we do that, we need to separate their RGB channels. So I'm adding a converter separate RGB node, so I can have a look at the separate channels, and each of which will give me a good way to mask my different colors to get a very rich and contrasting landscape. If I want to make an Orange Canyon landscape, I would introduce some color ramps. So let's have a look which is the most useful to start off. I think the first one might be very good to differ between sand and stone. There is a lot of concave areas where it's getting whiter, while the steep walls, the rocky walls, are very dark. So I can think of the steep walls being orange and dark orange down here, and the brighter areas being sandy and yellowish. And of course we can increase the contrast of this by moving these nodes closer to each other. So we see a lot of sand between the rocky areas. In order to better mix this with the other channels, I would suggest to use a mix RGB node rather than a colored color ramp, so that the color ramp only acts as the factor between the colors. So here I would leave it at white and the lower one at black, and instead choose the sand and rock color down here, because this way we still have a whole slot which we can use with other masking and other color mix nodes. For example, the rocky orange can now be mixed using a brownish tone and a brighter orange tone, varied by the green channel of our simple color attribute. I just have to plug it in here, and I will see some more variation in the colors. If I want to increase the contrast in this structure, then also I will add the color ramp to the green channel and adjust it so that I can see the result of my colors. Maybe increase the color contrast here, and there we go, we see the result right away. I think it will look better if I swap the two colors, and for that I will just change the position of the black and white node of the marks in the color ramp. A little more contrast, like this. And the same goes for the color 2 for the sandy areas, which look a little bit too green to me. Let's increase the saturation a little bit more. Remember, this is the sand, so we still can use the FlowMap to vary our intensity of sand flowing down. How would we achieve that? I would now connect the flow in between here so that it will change the mask of how much sand is flowing down. For this, I will use a math node and set the mode of the math node to multiply add. Now I can take the flow and put it into the value, and the original red channel of our color attribute stays in the addend input field. The more I increase the multiplier, the more this FlowMap will influence the mask between sand and stone. And if I want more flow, I can do so by changing the strength of our FlowMap. This is one way to introduce the FlowMap. And if I want to have even more detail and more variation in the flow of this map, then I can drive the strength using another color attribute, another data set of our erosion simulation. So let's duplicate this color attribute and, for example, use the rain, river, and white flow color attribute. Again, we want to separate RGB and use the third one, the white flow, as factor for the strength. And if we want to increase the strength overall, then we just need to multiply this white flow influence. So only at the areas where the white flow is visible, you will see that the flow map will generate rivers of sand. And where white flow is not present, there won't be much sand flowing down. Again, we can use the flow intensity to color our sand and make it dirtier. The longer it stayed there or the longer it flew, then the dirtier the sand will be. And for this, I also use a mix RGB node, and this time I will use the sediment output of the flow map to color the sand. It will give a quite long gradient from the hills down to the valleys, and therefore a very smooth color variation of the sand itself. Let's think about how to color it a little bit more brownish, where there is a few flow, and bright and pale yellowish where there was a lot of flow. So much for the color. But what do we do to add more detail to its structure? You probably guessed that already. We are going to introduce a bump map and some texture. So to adjust my texture, I will ignore the rest and plug the texture right in the base color so I can see it. I will set the projection from flat to box, so it's projected from all axes. And to have a convenient projection, I will set its vector space to input texture coordinate object vector space. Now the texture will be projected from the top, from the x-axis, and from the y-axis of this landscape mesh. If it's scaled or stretched in a strange way, then we can adjust that by using a vector mapping node. I see that the texture seems to be stretched along the z-axis or squeezed together along the z-axis, so I will decrease that one. And if I need the whole texture to be smaller for a certain factor, then I will increase the x and y axis and the z axis with a factor according to its squeeze relation. I think the texture is small enough now, and I want to add a vector bump node so I can use this texture as height for my bump. And right away we see a lot more detail in the landscape. But this is just the bump mapping for the rocky parts. And if we remember, we used a mask to drive how much of sand is flowing between the areas. So our mask will show white when we have sand and black if we have rocky parts. So the black parts are the ones where we want the bump mapping to be shown. We could now add an alpha channel, especially in the white part, of 0%, or at least very, very small, 0.077, to drive the strength of the bump node. Meaning that where the sand is flowing, we have no bump detail, but at the rocky parts, we see that the rock texture generating a lot of detail. If we increase the width of the flow map, we will see that in the valleys, the sand rivers get wider and wider, covering more of the rocks. And to add a sense of depth, we can use some volume shading in order to simulate atmosphere. Be sure that the volume shading cube is surrounding your landscape and that its density is low enough so you can see through and light through your landscape. But this is just one of the many ways to use the color attributes and the flow map generated by the simulation. I hope you see the use of the Erosion add-on and how it helps you to increase the quality and the detail of your landscapes. See you soon. Bye.